Hi, welcome to Tonnau Talks. My name is Dr. Karis Rees. I'm the Senior Specialist Educational Psychologist for Neath Talbot Local Authority. And I've got with me today Caitlin Davis, who's our Assistant Educational Psychologist. Today we're going to be talking about supporting exam stress, which is a really important factor for us to consider this time of year. As we know, lots of pupils in year 10, 11 and 12 and 13 will be preparing for their exams, and it can be a really tough time for all. As you can see on our screen there, we do have a QR code, so you can scan that and gain access to our live sessions that are coming up. Have a look at what we've got there, and also we welcome any kind of suggestions or recommendations for our Tonnau Talks, but ones that you would find really helpful as a family in this local authority. Don't forget, we have an opportunity for you to ask questions throughout this Tonnau Talk. So make sure that you stay tuned later on, where we'll be answering live questions from parents who are listening as we record. So Caitlin, we know the exam period is a stressful time for our students, and it's the time that most adults we remember vividly when we're in school. Do we know why exam time is as stressful as it is for our teenagers?
Yeah, Cass, I think we've got a pretty good idea. Obviously, there's always going to be those individual differences, and we're all going to have unique experiences of exam times. We know from our own experience as adults and perhaps of the children we might be working with or our own children. But research has kind of established a pretty good idea of why our teenagers feel such a high level of stress in these situations. Putway in 2008 identified four main reasons for exam stress. So first of all, we've got consequences. So exams are stressful basically because of their kind of educational or their occupational consequences. So, for example, achieving sufficient GCSE grades for sixth form or college, or the vague understanding the higher GCSE grades are required for a quote unquote kind of good job. There's a lot of kind of consequences riding on those examinations. Furthermore, there's a second one in terms of markers of self-esteem. So students or children try to judge themselves on the basis of their grades, and a good kind of grade results in high self-esteem. To a greater or less extent, there's been an internalization of the message that esteem can be enhanced through educational achievement, and so our children place a lot of weight on how they do in their exams. Judgment from others. This is another kind of something that can cause a lot of stress, whether that be perhaps their peers, their teachers. A lot of our young people build connections with authority figures like teachers in their lives, and they don't want to disappoint them, similarly to the way they don't want to disappoint us. And of course, parents, there can be a pressure there of not wanting to let parents down, or not wanting to upset them. And then the wider kind of societal pressure to achieve, that social comparison with their friends, like I said, and that kind of links into that consequences, of have I done good enough? Am I going to get a good enough job? Am I going to be able to go on to do the things that I want to do? And finally, there is kind of that idea of a fear appeals that are made by adults. And again, this is something that we all have experience of. So there can be these messages that kind of can be communicated to students over time about the importance of their exams. And kind of there can be these messages that can be quite distressing around, if you need 5 GCSEs to get onto this course, or you won't be able to get as good of a job. And even though they're intended as motivational strategies, in the sense of we want to motivate our children to do well, to revise, to put the effort in. Unfortunately, they can add to the distress, it can add to that kind of worry around, what's going to happen if perhaps I don't do as well, or what's going to happen if this or that happens. So these fear appeals, which we think are helpful, are not always as helpful as we would, we're kind of setting out for them to be. In addition to this, there's more practical elements of exam stress. There's time pressures. There's that figuring out your study style or your revision style. What works for you. I think that can add a lot of stress. Exhaustion and tiredness, having to sit multiple exams in one day. Having to, kind of revise for multiple exams in a week, having to prepare for exams while still completing other activities like coursework, and the kind of impact this has on relationships and perhaps social activities, and just generally kind of resources, that element of, packing your bag for the exam. Do I have enough pens? Do I have a calculator? Those types of things.
Gosh, Caitlin, that's really interesting. There's a lot there that you mentioned, especially when you're thinking in terms of, when we look back on what you said there were those issues that are kind of internal inside of
Mm,
us, those thoughts and those feelings about, you know, consequences you were saying there about, if I don't do well enough, I won't get into college, I won't get onto sixth form, and having that kind of pressure on yourself, as well as like, about their self-esteem, like, if I don't do well enough, I can't then, go with my friends to college to do that
mm,
course because I'm not as good as them, and that's really, affects them. Or maybe they've got like high achievers within the family and they want to be
yeah,
as good as their brother or sister or, auntie or uncle, and it's all of these things really do contribute to those feelings of being judged by others, like
mm,
you were mentioning, like, you got to be as, you got to do better than your sister, or you got to do, better than, I did. Because as parents, a lot of the time we want to, we're the ones that want our kids to do better than us, So
yeah,
ultimately, we're often like that voice in, to be trying to motivate them, but often putting so much fear in them as well,
yeah.
because like I want the best for you and I want you to do really well, so you've really got to try hard and this is your only chance. And often it's coming from a place of love, but we are so worried for them that actually we end up causing them more stress and anxiety.
Absolutely. And one thing I want to note there as well is how teenagers don't always make it easy on us,
No.
is we know that they can have difficulties where perhaps they don't revise as much as they should, or,
Mm,
they don't seem as a kind of concerned, as we would perhaps like them
yeah,
to be when they're taking their exams. And so that kind of that place of kind of making those appeals, that happens with context in the sense
yeah,
of you might be trying to really kind of, say to your teenager, come on now, this is
yeah,
important.
yeah, yeah,
So yeah, I
yeah.
just wanted to note that they don't always make it easy on us, and
No,
sometimes we use those kind of fear appeals as like a last minute kind
yeah,
of strategy to say, please,
please
please
try, yeah.
revise. Yeah.
But also you mentioned there the more practical side of doing an exam.
Mm,
I mean, let alone having that feeling of this is my only chance, I've got to do well now, and I want to keep up with my
mhm.
peers, I want to be able to have this lifestyle ahead of me as an adult. I mean, we're talking about kids that are like 15 years old here, and
Yeah.
that's a lot of pressure. But also you mentioned there about just those organizational skills to be able to
Mm,
go, right, I've got two exams this week. I know a lot of the kids have a lot more than that, But say, for example, they got two exams this week. How are they going to prepare for that? Do they know how to put together an exam timetable? And even if they have put one together at school, do they know how to best implement that at home,
mm,
taking into consideration the way that their house functions? Because they might have little brothers and sisters that, disrupt them. They might have additional, you know, responsibilities at home that they
yeah.
need to attend to, and it's really difficult for our young people to kind of figure that out, making sure they prioritize sleep, and that's so important.
Absolutely.
Cramming the night before. Except for some people, that's all right. One thing I will mention as well is like a lot of peers will say to each other, I'm not revising, oh, I haven't
Yeah.
done anything yet. And that can be really stressful because you might be thinking as a child, like, oh my gosh, my friends aren't revising, but they seem really chilled, and
Yeah.
a lot of the time they might not be telling the
No.
truth, they might be playing it cool, and that's important to note there. But is there anything else, Caitlin, that you think might contribute to why children feel stressed?
I think generally that there's this kind of idea that it's a limited sense of control, I think, in exam periods, in the sense of kind of they feel like they're kind of at a sort of precipice in their life where they're on the edge of something, and that
Mm,
they need to kind of pass these exams really well in these exams to be able to kind of progress in life. And they don't have a lot of life experience, so teenagers. And so we as adults with life experience, we're able to see, no, it's not the be all and end all. If you don't do so well in these exams, there are things we can put in place. our teenagers, unfortunately, don't have the same as, you know, as us. They're not able to see beyond this kind of mountain in their lives where they've got these huge exams. There's a lot of importance being placed on them by themselves, their peers, their parents, you know, their teachers, all the kind of important people within their lives. And that can be really, really challenging for them in terms of adding to that stress, of adding to that, well, that sense of hopelessness of, well, what am I going to do? You know, what happens? And there's that, like I said, that limited control of they they don't decide what exams they take. You know, they know they take their options, but they don't decide when those exams happen. They don't you know, they don't decide what's in those exams. You know, essentially they're presented with, you know, a booklet of paper on that day, and it's, you know, they've got an hour or however long they have, and that can be really, you know, disconcerting in the sense of when you feel like so much is weighing on it, that limited sense of control can actually be really, really distressing for young people. And we know that they're contending with their teenage brain at this time. So things kind of like emotional regulation can be really difficult for them. So things that are, you know, kind of stressful feel 10 times more stressful than perhaps they would for an adult brain. They don't perhaps have the same level of coping skills that we would have developed through our lives. And so they're feeling a lot of this stress and they're not quite sure what to do with it. They're not quite sure where to go with it or how to manage it. Um, and that's why we see a lot of the emotional kind of reactions that we see during exam times. They're also kind of more reward focused at this age, and so they're more sensitive to that sense of loss, that sense of if I'm actually not able to achieve in my exams what I'd like to achieve, or what I think people would like me to achieve, then that's going to feel like a huge loss to them. And again, they don't have the coping skills to be able to perhaps manage that loss or to problem solve that loss in the sense of being right, well, if I don't do this, I can do that. You know, I think as parents, perhaps we have a lot of those conversations, right? Well, you know, if you don't do so well, there's this we can do, there's that we can do. And our teenagers may seem like they're not listening to us, and it's because simply they can't see those alternative routes.
Yeah. I mean, the teenage brain has a lot to answer for, that's for sure. And
Mm,
I know we've done a Tonnau talk previously on the teenage brain and how best to kind of communicate with that brain. Because, like as Caitlin said, you know, there's a lot going on there. Like, the teenage brain is fascinating in the way that it
mm,
develops, you know, and different areas of the brain will be stronger than others because of the development. You know, it's diverse across different individuals. And as we know, especially in the teenage brain, it is more sensitive to stress. It is more sensitive to social kind of acceptance. You
mm.
know, those problem solving skills aren't so great. So they do come across as like, you know, like drama queens, like it's the end of the world, like, and, you know, and they're less responsive to kind of us supporting them because they often feel like we don't understand.
Yeah.
Even though, you know, a lot of us have also been through an exam, you know, period, they find it really difficult to seek comfort in us because often the comfort that our teenagers seek is through their peer relationships. And you know, it's a really tough time. And I would also, you know, always recommend checking out the teenage brain if you've got a teenager at home. That tonic talk is
Definitely.
really helpful.
Yeah. And another thing to note here is it's a time in their life where they're really striving for independence and
Yeah,
autonomy. They're striving for
yeah.
control, you know. They're like little adults and they're desperate to be adults and they're not quite there. So when you have something that's so out of their control, like exam time, it is really challenging for them. And you can see this is when they start to get frustrated. You might hear statements like, oh, it's not fair, you know, we got to do this,
Yeah.
then we got to sit these exams. And you know, it is because they're at a time in their life where they really want to be in control of their own life and they really want to make those decisions for themselves.
Mm,
But unfortunately, they're still in a place where, you know, the adults and the society around them are making a lot of decisions for them that have a huge impact on their life.
yeah,
So it's tricky, you know,
yeah.
it's a really tricky time.
Yeah. So now that we kind of understand that the amount of stress, like, you know, all those things that we talked about, those, you know, those inner beliefs, their self-esteem, and all those judgments that they feel, not only then coping with the practical side of exams, like organization, revision, you know, going into that exam hall room, you know, that it's
Mm,
very challenging. You know, let's think about you know, what things parents can keep an eye out in terms of in understanding the extent of the stress for their kids?
Yeah, I think every child who goes through exams is going to experience a degree of stress. It is a stressful time in their lives. There's no denying that. However, we want to make sure that that stress isn't kind of beyond what is typical or what we would expect a child to be experiencing. Because for some young people, it can become, a step beyond, in terms of how distressing, and it can have an impact on their mental health and well-being. And it's really important that we keep an eye out for that, is we want to make sure that they are, as happy and healthy and coping as best they can throughout this, despite the stress. Um, Exam stress can result in wider well-being difficulties if it's not supported, and some children who experience challenges with well-being may be more impacted by exam stress. So if they have difficulties with their mental health and well-being, this stress may kind of cause that to kind of worsen.
Mm.
Research has suggested there's kind of three components of exam stress. So there's a cognitive element, so that's kind of the brain, the thinking element. So it's like the negative thoughts, the kind of depreciating self-statements. So like, for example, if I fail this exam, my whole life is a failure, those types of catastrophizing statements.
Yeah.
And the kind of the performance inhibiting difficulties that come out of this. So, I think we've all been there. I know myself, there's been plenty of exams where I've sat down and I've turned that first page over, my mind has gone blank. And
Yeah.
I can't even remember my name, never mind, what kind of
Pythagoras theorem
yeah,
is, yeah.
absolutely. And that's the cognitive element. When we are under stress, parts of our cognition, our brain functioning don't work as well as we
Yeah.
would like them to. We know that eventually take a couple of deep breaths and that memory comes back to you, but it's a really, really frightening thing, especially when we're under pressure and we know that we're about to be, taking part in an exam. The second part, the second kind of component of the stress is the affective. So that's kind of the emotional. So it's like the physiological impact. So like the tension, the tight muscles, loss of appetite, needing to use the toilet more often, increased heart rate, shaking, sleep difficulties. Um,
They're going to get a lot of, stomach issues as well.
yeah.
Pains in his stomach, needing, to.
Yeah, and that can add to the anxiety, For
Oh,
a teenager is very self-conscious anyway.
yeah.
So that idea of perhaps an accident happening or,
Yeah.
that can cause them a lot of worry.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be really tricky in exams where there is kind of monitored toileting in the sense of, you've got to put your hand up in front of everybody and ask to go. Those sort of things can add to the stress as well. And finally, we got behavioural. So, that's kind of things like procrastination, avoiding, not being able to kind of, like Cara said, implementing those revision timetables as well as they would like to. And in terms of how this kind of can translate in a child's presentation, they may be struggling to sleep, they may have outbursts or mood swings. They may be kind of always thinking about exams and worrying about them, kind of, I suppose it's that kind of 1,000 yard stare. You might be out doing something that the child previously enjoyed, but they're not engaged and you can see their mind is elsewhere, that type of thing. Feeling tense, losing appetites, getting headaches, feeling unwell, having negative thoughts for the future, becoming withdrawn or kind of losing interest in hobbies or interests. So there's a number of things as a parent, your child, you are the expert on your child, and you will know when they are presenting in a way that isn't like themselves. And it's important that if you do notice that they are presenting in a certain way, that you kind of put the steps in place to support them through that.
Okay. Yeah, and you mentioned there a lot of different things that can be going on for our children, and a lot of these happen with general,
Yeah.
feelings of anxiety. If we're going, for a job interview or something as adults, we might not feel like we can eat,
Mm,
we feel ill, and things like that. So what you're describing there, Caitlin, is normal.
yeah.
And that's what it's really important that we share with our kids, is that it's normal to feel this way because they
Yeah.
are under stress, and this is our body's way of keeping us safe. So feelings of anxiety are there for a reason. And all of these things that you said, about the struggling to sleep, the mood swings, not being able
Hmm.
to remember your name and
Yeah.
things like that. As much as it's frustrating and really poor timing,
Yeah.
those things are normal. And I think it's really important that we share that with our kids to say, look, gosh, when I feel stressed and worried,
Mm.
this is how it happens for me. And I get a really bad stomach. I don't want to eat. I feel sick. My mouth gets dry, whatever it is. You find it difficult to function normally, and that's meant to happen. It's normal. Don't get me wrong, it's unhelpful sometimes,
Yeah,
especially when you've got exams coming up. But ultimately, giving our children that understanding and that information about, well, this is your body doing something to protect you, it helps them feel a little bit more normal
yeah.
then, because we don't want our kids struggling in silence,
No,
you know?
absolutely not. And like you said, if you're noticing that this is kind of it's excessive and it's
Mm.
prolonged, and this is above and beyond what
Yeah,
you would expect in terms of your child and their usual self, it's really important that we kind of, we access our support so we can get them, the support that they need and the coping tools that they need. So you might want to speak to school, make them aware, and explore any kind of additional support they can
yeah. Because
provide.
often schools will put on revision classes and
Yes,
things
of
like that,
course. Yeah.
So it's important to raise that with your school, just to
Yeah.
share that, obviously share it with your teenager first, and about how helpful it is. But it's about, seeing what school can do to help, because
Yeah.
they've got so many resources there that they
And a
can.
lot of them do exam stress workshops and stuff
Yeah,
like that as well. And, it might just be something that will just, give your child a little bit of peace of mind.
yeah,
However, if your concerns kind of go above and beyond that, you can speak to your GP. If you feel like this is, really above and beyond,
yeah,
your child is really, really distressed. It's kind of, they're feeling really anxious, really low.
yeah,
Speak to your GP, and again, liaise with school to look at other options. If you have any concerns that your child has any thoughts of hurting themselves or taking their own lives and that they're a risk to their own safety, please, call 111 option 2 or take them straight to A&E. So if
yeah,
your child's negative thought has got to the point where they feel like they no longer want to be in this world, or they want to harm themselves in any way, then please know that you
yeah.
can access that support to get them the kind of the support that they need in that moment as soon as
Yeah,
possible.
and that's really important to recognize that. And I
Mm.
think that's this distinguish, to distinguish between what is normal
Yeah,
for to feel during exam times and what is not normal. And no, we don't expect children to feel like harming themselves, and
mm.
that's really important. Thank you for raising that, Caitlin. Um, Moving on, so for those children that are feeling what we'd expect to be those anxious feelings around exams, how can our parents support our children who are experiencing exam stress?
Well, there's actually a number of ways that, parents can support, and a lot of this you would probably be already doing or be aware of it in some ways. But thinking about support for exam stress, there's two main areas. You're going to kind of got our emotional support and our practical support. So first of all, we're going to take a look at the kind of emotional support aspect.
Okay, so what is emotional support, Caitlin?
So when I talk about emotional support, I'm talking about strategies parents can employ to support their child to kind of cope with and manage their emotions.
Okay, so in terms of helping parents to sort of uh, help their children to cope with and manage these emotions, what things would you do?
So first and foremost, be available to talk. That there's such a power in that conversation of listening to your child about what they're going through, what they're experiencing, what their emotions are. As a parent, that can be really helpful to kind of have that chat with them during this time, being there for them, encouraging them to talk about their worries, their feelings, kind of to let you know if there's anything that, that they are finding particularly difficult. You're not going to know unless they tell you. It might be helpful for you to kind of arrange some downtime for them in between the exams so they can recharge before the next exam. That can be really, really helpful because it's really important to have that balance, in terms of kind of in a sense of, them having that time to process their emotions, to kind of come down from the stress of one exam before they enter into the stress of another. And it's about listening to them, That's more important. You don't necessarily have to say anything. I think sometimes we worry that we don't have the words, but just listening, just being there, just being somebody that they can even just rant to,
Yeah.
just to kind of get it all out of their system. That's really, really important.
And I think sometimes, Caitlin, that can be difficult for parents because we often feel we need to be advisors,
Yeah.
advising on what to do. And, when anyone's experiencing stress, telling someone what they should do isn't helpful at that
Yeah.
time. And I think it's really tough sometimes for parents because we desperately want our children to do the best and feel the best.
Mm,
And often that can be our strategy is to tell them how to do it,
yeah.
and what we don't realize is that it's kind of judgmental for them. It's because, we're telling them how they should be doing things, and that doesn't align
Yeah.
with them, because we don't understand exactly how they're feeling. So when a child is like, oh, I'm feeling, that the exams are so much, oh, I know exactly how you feel because when I did my exams, but unfortunately, no, we don't know exactly
Yeah.
how they feel. And when you're saying to give them time to talk, what we got to do as parents is not rush in with
Yeah.
advice. It would be like, I'm really struggling, I'm feeling stressed about my exams. Right, okay. I put my mobile phone down.
Mm,
I make sure that it's just me and my teenager together, no disruptions from anyone
yeah.
else in a private area, so no one else is listening.
The
Just be like,
car is great for this.
oh, I love the
Car
car. Yeah,
journey.
because you're driving, you're not making that eye contact, which some kids can find difficult. And you can say, right, tell me what's going on.
Mm,
And that is so important because we need to avoid rushing into saying, well, we'll revise more together. I'll help you. I'll do
yeah.
this. We can do this. I'll make sure this. I'll have a word with the teacher. That can be very overwhelming. And when it's given time to talk, it's given time for them to talk, not for you to
Yeah.
talk. And that's
Absolutely.
really important.
And just being mindful as well of some of those kind of what we think is like helpful suggestions or kind of little reminders, can be perceived by our teenagers being criticisms. So kind of that, well, have you revised or kind of,
Yeah.
how many, past papers have you done today? And I know we're just checking in with parents and I think we're just as stressed as they are when they're going through this time period, but they can take that as a criticism. So it might just be helpful there about kind of just reframing, just kind of saying, oh, how are things going today? And, kind of, is there anything you're finding difficult you'd like me to help with? Or do you want to
Mm.
have a come a chat? That can just be, kind of for your teenager, they may respond better to that than, that kind of, and even though you're just wondering what they've done today, for them that can, be perceived as a criticism or
Mm.
kind of a judgment in a way.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think in terms of when we're kind of thinking about like closer to the exam time, before they go in, this can be a really, this can be a bit of a crisis point, can't it, before
Yeah.
they go in, where the kind of the stress peaks and they, they're about to kind of face, kind of Goliath, aren't they? But when before they go in, just be reassuring, just kind of again, it's being there to talk, let them know, they have those kind of statements in the bank about, it isn't kind of, even though it feels it, it really is so stressful, that this isn't the end of the world. If they don't do as well, there are things that we can do. It's just about trying their best. And if they've tried their best, that's all they can do. So just having those reassuring conversations with them. And even if you're just listening to them, again, that would be really helpful in that time of crisis. And after each exam, again, it's just being there for them to come to you and talk it through. It doesn't have to be a kind of breakdown, play by play of the exam, but
Mm.
just, how do you feel after that? Kind of,
Yeah.
just to check in, just to
Yeah.
check in, really. Okay, what's your next one? Or how are you feeling about that? It's just important that we're kind of, just like I said, just being there, just checking in, being reassuring, being comforting, so that those emotions don't necessarily get the best of them.
And also is the timing as well, because
Yeah.
we all know when our kids were little and they'd come out of school and we go, how was school today? What have you done? And they'd say nothing,
Yeah.
because they're exhausted,
Yeah.
So when they come home from school after their exam and you want to ask them how it's gone, they're going to be exhausted. And also, they're not always going to want to talk about it. And also, their brain, when we think about the effects of anxiety, those feelings of anxiety on the brain, they're also going to recall it either.
No.
So when you say, did that question come up? you might be provoking more anxiety in them
Yeah.
because they'll be like, I don't know, they can't remember, So just after an exam has happened, I think it's probably not best to kind of
Yeah.
question them about that at that time. And also, it's not always good to go over what they did or
No.
didn't do because we all know whenever, say, for example, we've recently been for a job interview, you come out of that and someone say, did you tell them about this? Did you tell them about that? And you think, oh gosh, I forgot to say that.
Yeah.
You end up feeling so negative and deflated about it. And that's what we don't want to do for our kids because ultimately they got another exam coming up. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes it's more helpful for us to go, do you know what? Well done for getting through that exam
Yeah.
today. How are you feeling about the next one? Let's think about what we can do to prepare for that, and those conversations need to happen, well after the exam because they are going to be exhausted and they are going to still feel stressed and they, in their own mind, privately, they are probably already ruminating over the things they didn't do.
Yeah.
And the worst thing that also happens is when they talk to their friends and
Yeah.
their friend says, oh my gosh, I was writing so much for that
Yeah.
essay question, did you write about so and so and so and so? And your child might be thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't talk about that. I wrote about
Yeah.
something completely different,
Yeah.
and they could be so stressed.
Yeah, and it's like I put 54 down for question 5. Did you? I
Yeah,
put 3.
yeah, you know, and yeah, and that those conversations about what you did or didn't write in that
Yeah,
exam,
yeah,
they're not helpful. So, yeah, timing is key here. I wouldn't ask them as soon as they come out. I think the first thing I'd be
yeah,
asking when they come in is like, what would be helpful now?
yeah,
Would it
yeah,
be helpful for me not to talk to you and question you?
yeah.
Would you like to go and watch telly for an hour and
Yeah.
just chill?
Yes,
You
focusing on those
know?
basic needs, isn't it?
Yeah,
Do you need to eat? Do you need to have a nice hot drink? Do you need to go for a hot shower
yeah.
or bath? Do you need
Lie
to
in a
just
dark room.
lie in a
Oh, in
dark
your
room?
room.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I love that as well, of asking them what do they need.
Yeah.
Again, it's giving them that
Yeah.
control.
Yeah.
And those conversations about coping are going to be really, really helpful
Yeah.
here as
Yeah.
well, is kind
Absolutely.
of allowing them, to kind of explore what, when they are feeling these big emotions, what is going to be helpful for them.
Yeah.
And you can give some suggestions here as well. We've got some suggestions on kind of the screen, when you're having those kind of discussions about coping strategies or what might be helpful for them in that moment. You can introduce them to those things. So one thing we've looked at perhaps is like breathing or grounding. These are things
Yeah.
that we find helpful that you might want to introduce. So you've
So
got,
what are these techniques then? I've heard about them, Caitlin.
yeah.
Can you describe them?
So breathing is kind of what it says in the tin, really. So obviously when we feel stressed and we feel worried, our heart rate increases and we kind of breathe quicker to get more oxygen into the body to kind of get the heart to assist the heart really in pumping blood that quickly. Um, but what happens is our brain kind of associates that fast breathing with worry. So the faster we breathe, the more worried we are because our brain's like, well, what's going on?
Yeah.
So breathing techniques are just about slowing down that breathing. It's just to kind of to calm our heart down, to calm our brain down. You find it often has like a really relaxing effect in the sense of our brain no longer thinks that we're in kind of fight or flight mode,
Mm.
and it can start to kind of process things. It can start to kind of come back online, if you will. So the 4-7-8 technique is something that people, and if you kind of Google breathing techniques online, you'll find there's box breathing, starfish breathing, there's a
Yeah.
number of them, right? So if this doesn't work for you or your child, just chuck it into Google and it does this usual amazing thing. But 4-7-8 is just you inhale for 4 seconds deeply, and it has to be through your nose. This is a proper kind of like chest raising kind of deep breath. Hold that breath for 7 seconds and then just exhale it slowly for 8 seconds. And you just repeat that as many times as you need to. This is one that, to be honest with you, breathing is one of the things, is one of the kind of the main things I tell young people about when I'm talking to them about exam stress.
Yeah.
When you go into a stressful situation, take deep breaths. It sounds so simple, but you'd be amazed at the difference it
Mm.
kind of it makes.
Mm.
And then grounding is again something that we look at when somebody's really distressed and we want to kind of bring them back into the moment. So like, with stress and worry, your brain can kind of run away with you a little bit and kind of, put all these thoughts in your head, and to kind of stop those and bring them into the present, we look at kind of grounding. So this is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it's just as simple as 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And that brings you back into the moment. These may not be things that may be helpful for your child. So it's about learning what is, what is helpful. And you can explore this together, because these might be things that might be helpful for you when you've got stress in your life.
Things like going for a walk
Yeah,
outside, getting some fresh air, listening to their favorite
song.
music,
Yeah, absolutely.
going to be with the dog, or
Yeah,
even going to just hang out with their cousins or something, because they,
that
yeah,
distraction.
exactly.
Yeah,
It's things like that, going out and having a hot chocolate or something.
yeah. It's that comfort, isn't it?
Yes,
When,
yeah,
when we feel unsafe, sometimes we want those kind of novel, sometimes we talk about like those novelty distracted techniques, like do something new, distract your
yeah,
brain. That's not actually that helpful. What we want is we want comfort, we
mm,
want familiarity.
yeah,
So things like, having that hot chocolate, they may have loved since they were a child,
mm,
going for like having a little cutch on a sofa. You might be surprised with your teenagers doing this time. They may not have kind of cutched you or looked in your way for kind of a couple of years maybe, but when actually they come and give you a cutch in the kitchen out of
yeah,
the blue, it's because their body wants that comfort, it
yeah,
wants that safety of,
yeah,
actually, I feel really unsafe, I feel really out of control at the moment, and I'm going to want to rely on things that actually, are familiar to me and do give me that sense of safety and control.
yeah,
Something that is helpful when we're talking about control as well is something we call kind of circles of control, focusing on what they can control about the situation as opposed to what they cannot control, and then for example, they can control how much they revise, they can control, kind of the things they put in their bag before they go into the
yeah,
exam, and focusing on those. But yeah, it's just about supporting them to kind of cope with those emotions. And we want to celebrate those small wins as well, acknowledge those little small achievements along the way. It's going to help build their confidence. But also one thing is really important as well is being mindful of your own emotions and
mm,
being flexible during this time.
mm,
They're going to be highly distressed. They're going to be going through a lot of things. They're going to have a lot of pressures on them they haven't had before. So when they're revising all day, I know it's really hard because we want to keep them in that routine, but perhaps being more flexible about their household jobs, about their kind of room being
yeah,
done and,
yeah.
kind of make sure that you kind of, you have that flexibility and recognizing that things can be done at a different time.
But also, like in terms of the whole family, when they've got times where
Yeah,
they're meant to be revising, it's not the best time for your youngest best friend to come over and play. Thinking about how you're managing the whole
yeah,
household,
absolutely.
so it's about giving them that space and that time to be able to revise and focus without having those distractions is really important. There's lots
Yes,
of great strategies here, Caitlin. I know you can also listen to our other Tonnau talks, such as raising resilience,
yeah,
coping with anxiety is another one that we did, that you can listen back to with lots of strategies there to support our children. The talking to teens one is really good because it does
mm,
include all this validation and how to communicate, and talk about difficult things with our teens. So this is really good in helping with those internal issues
mm.
that that our teenagers are facing with exam stress. Like you talked about feeling judged, that self-esteem. These stresses are really helpful, Caitlin. But I'm thinking in terms of those practical things. Like when we talked about the stress of just preparing for an exam.
Yeah.
Being able to revise and packing the night before for your bag and knowing what to do, and there's a uniform there.
Have you got the
Um,
right pencil
Yes,
case?
exactly. You know, so as parents, how can we help them with those practical
But
issues?
absolutely, like you said, there's a number of practical elements of the kind of exam time. And a lot of it actually links to kind of our stress responses. So the first thing practically I would kind of suggest is making sure that your child's basic needs are being met, okay? So make sure they're eating,
Okay.
and that they're eating a balanced diet. That's going to help them to feel good. I think we always hear about the kind of the breakfast myths, don't we, with exam. Everyone has like a breakfast that they had. I think mine was like porridge and banana. That was meant to be like my superfood when I was going to um into exam. It's less about the food, but it's more about just giving your brain those calories, giving your brain
Yeah,
something to work with. Same with drinking water as well.
absolutely. Yeah.
These things are really important for your child's general health, but also
Mm.
will make them feel that a little bit better when they're going into. It'll also take away the stress of their stomach perhaps grumbling in the exam, which I know some
Yeah.
people worry about.
Yeah.
So yeah, but we want to avoid kind of high fat, high sugar, high caffeine stuff. We want to be really mindful of caffeine during this time
Yeah.
because remember it's a time where there's limited sleep anyway, and some people will turn to caffeine,
And especially those energy
energy drinks.
drinks. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're particularly bad.
So we want to be mindful that, and we want to kind of gently encourage our children away from that and to healthier options. Helping your child to get enough sleep is another important thing. Good sleep improves thinking and concentration. So support them in building those good sleep routines,
Mm.
having that kind of bedtime routine to wind them down before sleep, stopping them from, doing things that might kind of work against that. So using their phone or watching TV or
Yeah.
those types of thing, allow them to really get in a good routine, just generally, but also with that bedtime of winding down what needs to be done, to get, I suppose, that melatonin kicking in,
Yeah.
those sleep hormones kicking in so that they can have as good a sleep as they possibly
Yeah.
can. Don't get me wrong, their stress hormones are going to be high at this time, so they might wake throughout the night.
Mm.
But again, it's giving them as good a foundation for sleep as you possibly can.
Yeah, that's really, really important. And we did do another Tonnau
Yeah.
talk on sleep, which has got lots of tips and strategies if your teenager is struggling with sleep during this time. What else, Caitlin, is important?
Physically exercise is really good. It helps boost energy levels, clears the mind, and relieves stress.
Yeah,
So encourage them to, like Cara said, go for them walks.
yeah,
And walks are great because it's great for the body in that it burns the stress hormones.
yeah,
It's also great for clarity of mind. I
yeah.
think a lot of people talk about going for a good walk, helps put the world to right in your
Oh,
mind. And there
yeah,
might be things that perhaps that they might be struggling to work out when they've been looking at a book all day, but take them for a walk and it might suddenly click
yeah,
in their minds.
yeah,
So that exercises, but even the exercise they enjoy,
yeah,
having a good dance,
yeah,
having like a kitchen dance,
yeah.
going swimming, be mindful of safety as well in this weather, at
Yeah.
this time of year.
Well, I know in Japan, GPs prescribe walking
Okay,
as a medication for stress.
that's
Yeah, so
amazing.
outdoors, not on the treadmill
Yeah.
indoors, but it's outdoors in the daylight. So all these factors contribute to healthy sleep and
Mm,
healthy mind. So yeah, it's something that's really, really important. So if you can get your teenager outside in the daylight, walking, whether
mm,
they don't have to talk to you or they don't have to
no,
go with you, but if they can, if you can get them walking the dog, that'd be one thing that they do every day. It's really important for them more than the dog, but
absolutely.
it's about prioritizing these things, especially during this time.
Yeah. Making time for treats as well is nice,
Yes, yeah.
We don't want it to be all hard work and no play because then the motivation isn't going to be there, when they're kind of spending, significant amounts of the day revising. One, their brain's not going to be able to keep up with that,
Mm.
it needs to be in kind of manageable chunks. But children, teenagers are very reward driven. So allowing them to have those little breaks, those little treats is going to be really, really helpful for them
Yeah,
during this time.
great.
And
So,
oh,
oh,
sorry,
sorry,
Karen, I was going to
Caitlin.
say, and just
Yeah.
finally, in terms of that those kind of basic needs, encourage breaks and self-care. They need to have that time to take a break, to kind of take care of their needs and, look after themselves,
Mm.
um, to help them cope.
Yeah, lovely. So, what about I know we talked there, there's some really great strategies, getting enough sleep, exercise, having those treats and those breaks of self-care. But what about those practical things about preparing them for those exams? What kind of things can we do as parents?
I suppose mainly it's just helping them with that study, isn't it? It's helping them to implement that, revision timetable to study in a way that works for them. So some things that might be helpful is kind of assisting them to set clear goals, to create a schedule itself. Organization, teenagers are not always great at being organized. They're going to need a lot of help there. So, organizing their studies and materials. Do they have all the books that they need? Do they have the supplies that they need? Are they in an accessible place? Are they kind of somewhere where they know where they are? Using planners might be helpful. This can be kind of physical ones or digital tools to keep track of assignments and exam dates. Time management, that's something you can support with, helping them to prioritize tasks, particularly if your child is unfortunate enough to have two exams in one day, there's a high level of time management in terms of how you revise for that situation. Help them with that. We don't necessarily want to give them the answers. I just want to note this before I move on. We want to help them to find the answers.
Yeah.
So we want to ask them, what do you think would be helpful with this? Or what do you think you can do about this? Because that's going to help them with their problem solving skills. And it's going to help them as they move on to other similar situations or stressful situations in their lives.
But also they're more likely to engage with it if
Yeah,
it's something that they've developed themselves. So,
absolutely.
if you're putting a schedule in front of them saying, right, I've done an ideal schedule for you, put in all the breaks,
Yeah.
they're not going to stick to that as well as something that they would develop themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Timers might be helpful. So you might have heard of people talking about like Pomodoro technique or stuff like that.
Oh, what's that, Caitlin?
Oh, so that's it's kind of a focusing technique. So our brain can only really focus for kind of so much time before we become distracted and stuff like that. So that's kind of using that idea. And basically, I believe Pomodoro is 20 minutes. So it has a little time and you have 20 minutes where you focus, right? So
Okay.
you kind of, so say now I have to read this paragraph, this part of a page, I have to copy it out, right? So I would do that in that 20 minutes. But during that time, that's the only thing that I do. So my phone would be switched off, my phone would be put aside, or the TV would be off, or I'd be in a quiet space. I have that intense focus for 20 minutes,
Mhm.
and then I have a 5 minute break
Okay.
or maybe a 10-minute break, depending on. So it's chunking that time into, I'm going to set this time for, I'm going to really intensely focus here, but then I know I'm going to have a little break. And
Yeah.
then I go back to it. It just helps your brain to kind of keep that focus.
And you were saying 20 minutes now. I know a lot of students will be doing, I'm going to do 2 hours, I'm going to cram for
Yeah.
2 hours, then I'm going to have an hour break. So what you're saying, Caitlin, is that the brain it copes far better with 20-minute breaks, sorry, 20 minutes like
Yeah.
session of revision, and then 5 to 10 minute break, and then another 20 minutes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Or, finding what works for them. But basically, we want it to be shorter and
Yeah.
we want it to have that kind of those breaks incorporated. We want them to have shorter, more frequent breaks, and we
Yeah.
want them to have shorter but more frequent periods of intense concentration.
Okay.
And that's going to be more helpful for them. It also is going to reduce that exhaustion.
Yeah.
Your brain can only function for so long at a high level,
Yeah.
and this is about doing it in a way that kind of is mindful of their health as well, because that 5 to 10 minutes they can go and have a hot chocolate, or they
Mm.
can I know they will grab their phones, but
Yeah.
they might go and stand out in the sun for 10
Yeah.
minutes. It can be those things.
And I think that those breaks are really important, as in
Mm,
they're not just so say that if they're revising in their bedroom, which a lot of them are, it's not just then staying there, sat there and just going on the phone for 10 minutes. It is about getting out of that room,
yeah,
preferably outside in the sunlight, where they can walk or
yeah,
I know our teenagers are going to choose to go on their phones, and we understand that, but maybe they are outside in the garden on their phone for
yeah.
10 minutes, they've come downstairs, they've walked a bit, so I think that's key here is getting out of that room,
Yeah.
that to have that proper break.
And you can incorporate those bigger breaks. If they did 5 cycles of Pomodoro and then they have a half an hour break or an
Yeah,
hour break,
yeah,
you can incorporate those bigger breaks where you can
yeah,
encourage that kind of that more mindful break in a sense of it's mindful of their needs and meeting those basic needs.
Yeah.
And one thing I will suggest, in terms, I would encourage them to have a designated space for revision. I know a lot of young people revise on their bed. That's not necessarily helpful for their sleep because we want them to associate their bed with just sleep.
Mm.
It's similar with the phone. I wouldn't encourage teenagers. I know that they do to use their phone when they're in bed because unfortunately the brain then associates bed with fun things like swiping on TikTok or that type of thing. But we want their bed to be reserved, particularly in such a stressful time, for their sleep. So if they have a little desk or perhaps a little corner of your dining room table or whatever works best for them, perhaps if you've got an office, they can take over for a couple of weeks,
Mm.
being mindful of them having that designated space. When they sit down at that space, they know this is revision time.
Yeah.
And finally, just helping them to break things down can be really, really helpful. Like I said, it can feel like, that there's a mountain in front of them, this kind of Herculean task to get ready for these exams. Help them to break it down, to chunk it into more manageable bits and have that step-by-step approach, Okay, so we'll conquer what you want to achieve today. We'll conquer that today. Then we'll do this. Then we'll do that. Just to make it feel more manageable.
Okay. Wow, Caitlin, there's lots of strategies there that you've talked about. And I'm just thinking in terms of going back over those. So we know, in terms of exam stress, it happens in an emotional response, that self-esteem,
Mm,
those feelings of being judged, that I'm not good enough, that fear that you
yeah,
mentioned. And then
absolutely.
also those practical things of, you know, can I revise? And, how am I going to do it? How am I going to structure that? How am I going to cope with preparing for the actual exam? And you've given us some really good strategies and, things like, you know, helping us talk to our
Yeah.
teenagers. That's really important. Talking about reassuring them, not asking them too many questions, not giving too much advice and strategies. Allowing them that time to just be, to sort of absorb and
Yeah.
to understand like what's going on and celebrating those small wins. That's
Yeah.
really, really important. And then we've talked more about those practical things about eating,
Yeah.
diet, sleep. That should be at the top. That's so important. Having those exercise moments, getting out and
Yeah.
about, having treats as well, still having those treats and at time, those breaks for self-care, and all those other things about the practical bits about, helping them set
Mm,
goals, helping them create schedule, getting those essential study materials in place, having a planner, helping them with those time management things.
mm,
Time management is huge, prioritizing tasks, using timers. I love that Pomodoro technique that you
yeah.
talked about. And then also breaking them into smaller tasks. So instead of thinking, I'm going to revise all today for biology. No, just, okay, I'm going to revise for this part of the biology. I
Yeah.
think that's really important. So I'm now conscious, that we've talked a lot about preparing for exams and those exams themselves. What about the results? Results day.
So this is another this is another really tough day, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is they've done their exams, they've gone through that, they've done all that hard work, and then they have, well, first of all, they have the kind of the weight, which is kind of that
Torture.
anticipation build, yeah, of
Yeah.
course. And then, it gets to the data themselves. And, again, it's about being mindful of the weight that they are going to feel is placed on that day. It is going to feel like the be and end all for them, just because of the way their brain works, of their limited life experience, etc. So it is going to be a really tricky time, both leading up and on the day itself. And there's often a lot of emotions that they experience. It can be quite a roller coaster,
Mm.
results day.
But also, I think we need to help them to utilize the time in between.
Yeah,
When you think,
absolutely.
it's a great time for them to get a part-time job,
Yeah,
to focus on those interests that they had, those hobbies that they had as well,
yeah,
because, they don't go back to school. They have the longest summer
yeah,
holidays of their life.
absolutely.
And, when they get the exam results, it's at the end of August. They're
Yeah,
waiting all that time to be able to find out whether or not they can get on that
yeah,
college course or go to sixth form or go get that job that they want.
yeah,
So I think it's really important to help them utilize that summer, in a way that can help them feel like they're achieving things, but also takes their mind off
Mm.
that results day.
But I think that is one of the things that kind of, that we would advise parents to do is kind of plan those, not distractions, but, have those things in place where the child can, one, have that reward. They've just gone through a really difficult time in their life.
Mm.
It's also the summer before their lives are going to change.
Yeah,
It's a big change in their lives.
yeah,
I remember that time of my life where you feel like I said, you kind of at this point you've climbed the mountain
yeah,
and you're not quite sure what's going to happen next. So allowing them to kind of, like re-engage in those hobbies, have those
mm,
social connections, to engage in those social activities,
yeah,
have their, a part-time job, all of these things are going to be really, really helpful because it's going to take their mind off what's to come.
yeah,
And it's also just going to allow them to really reward themselves for a job well done,
yeah.
of getting through that really stressful time, and coming out the other side.
It gives them a sense of
Yeah,
purpose as well, and it
absolutely.
helps them to start, teenagers at this age, that are really trying to explore their identity and who they are and what they want from life. And I think it's really important at this time of, nothing, there's no school,
No,
it's a big time of change, big transition.
yeah,
We need to be helping them to use that time that is productive and
yeah,
gives them a sense of purpose and a sense of achievement so that if exam results day doesn't turn out so well, at least the time that they've spent in between the exams and getting the results, they've got a sense of, well, I've achieved this
yeah.
already, I've got better at my skill or interest, or
And there's other
I've got a
things in life.
part-time job. Yeah,
Yeah,
you
sorry,
know?
Kat. Just there's other things in life. I think that's helpful for
Yes,
them to know as well, is that their
exactly.
life isn't just these exams and what comes of these exams.
Yeah,
There's a number of aspects of their life that they
yeah,
can succeed in,
yeah.
just as
Because these
equally.
exams do not define them for the future. And I
Absolutely.
think that's what we need to make sure our kids
Yeah.
understand and believe as well. They believe that,
Mm,
these exams are the be all and end all. And if they don't do well now, then that's it for the rest of their life. They'll
yeah.
achieve nothing. But absolutely not. We all know as adults is that, you know, these exams are a tiny
A
moment of
blip.
our life. Some of us, it is a blip. We
Yeah.
didn't do as well as we wanted, but it doesn't stop us from
No.
achieving what we want. Um, I'm just thinking, just quickly, Caitlin, how can we as parents help prepare our child for results day?
I think in a way it just again goes back to that listening, being there, being approachable, allowing them to come to you for those conversations about their worries, their expectations, their plans, their goals, etc. Being mindful of the timing of that. But yeah, just being there as a parent to have those conversations, to again reassure, to comfort, to listen.
Mm,
You might want to share your own experiences, being mindful of how that might impact your young person.
yeah.
But yeah, it just goes back to, like I said, that emotional support, that helping them with coping, helping them, through your conversation and your listening, and in addition to, helping them find that purpose through
Yeah.
those activities.
And I think on the day as well, it's important to be led by them
Yeah,
because for some kids, it's really important that they're there early,
yeah,
and that they're able to be there before people, certain people,
yeah,
or your child might want to go later on during the day
yeah,
because they might not want to go and have their exams, open their results in front of their peers and their teachers.
yeah,
So it's really important to be led by them,
yeah,
and try and be as flexible as you can to support them and make sure that there is, if you need to go to work or have that important meeting, it's
yeah.
important that there is someone there to support your child.
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Kai. It's so important. But yeah, and aside from that, it's about kind of, accepting their feelings, not offering kind of immediate judgment or solutions. Just, there'll be plenty of time for those conversations. Kind of let them know that you love them, reassure them on that, show them that you're on their side, explore possible steps if you need to, but mostly just being led by them
Yeah,
and what is going to be helpful for them on
yeah.
that day.
And of course, for some kids, they're really disappointed on that day.
Yeah.
And I tell you one thing, that's not the time to say, well, I wonder why you didn't do so well. They know why they didn't do so well. And they would be feeling a huge sense of shame and guilt, and that self-esteem will be rock bottom. Yeah, absolutely. They might be feeling like, they've just defined their entire life by this, these results that are, really disappointing. And it's important for you as a parent, as much as we always want the best for them, sometimes we can come across as a bit critical, even just from our facial expressions, even though we're trying our best to be positive, but sometimes it's not the time to be positive. Sometimes it's the time to sit in that dark hole of shame and guilt and go, do you know what? It's really tough down here. I get that. I get that you feel rubbish. Instead of going, oh, don't worry, I'll be fine. You can resit them. You can do okay. Oh, I didn't do so well in my exams, and look at me now. That time, then they can't access that. They can't feel that. They'll just feel like you don't understand them. Instead, sometimes it can be hard for us as parents to not want to reassure our kids and cheer them up, and actually say, do you know what? I get why you're so disappointed, and I know you'll be feeling really hard on yourself right now. That can be far more helpful to them than us trying to prematurely, cheer them up.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back, like we said, that listening, that, just being there for them and, helping
Validating
them.
their
Yeah,
feelings.
validating their feelings and helping them to manage those difficult feelings if they should arise.
Yes, yeah. Lovely. So, Caitlin, tell us, what are our top tips to take away from this exam stress?
Okay, so number one, this will be of no surprise to you, take the time to talk to your child. Number two, help them to develop their coping skills. Number three, support them to take care of themselves, meeting those basic needs. Number four, be mindful of when the stress is too much for them. And five, remember that it's not forever.
Yeah.
Okay, this is not going to be forever. It is a really stressful period, but this too shall pass.
Yeah. And it's about normalizing those feelings. So yeah, you are going to feel stressed. This is a stressful time.
Yeah.
And it's important to focus on the fact that it will pass eventually.
Yeah, that quote I think has got me through a lot of stressful exam periods of this too shall pass,
Lovely.
And
Do we have any questions, Caitlin, that have come in?
We do have one question. So it's just around, I suppose, around parent well-being. So this parent has said that they feel like they are more stressed than their child, and they don't want this to necessarily impact their child, and they were wondering what would you recommend?
Oh, okay. So what the parent is feeling is that they're feeling more sort of stressed and anxious about their child, and maybe their child is kind of
Feeling about their exams.
more chilled out. And okay, so often it's the case of what we don't know. So I can imagine, parents wanting the best for their child, really kind of wanting to encourage them and get them revising, and maybe they're not seeing that, they're not seeing their child as even that bothered, possibly. And I think it's really important at this point is maybe all is not what you see, And I would always recommend that, parents take the time to kind of check in with themselves first, because it can be really frustrating if that you're really worried about something for someone and that person themselves aren't even bothered by it or appearing to be bothered by it. And it's really important that we check in with ourselves first before we go and have a chat with our teenager, because we don't know what they're feeling.
No.
A lot of teenagers go through a stage, and this is normal, where they withhold information from their parents. They don't share with their parents as much as they used to. And that can be really hard as parents, because we think, what were they keeping to themselves? They used to talk so much to me and now they don't. That unfortunately is a normal part of teenage life, that development. So I think what would be really helpful here is to do those checking in, is that having that time to talk. Your child might not want to want to stress you out. They might be thinking, actually, my mum or dad has got enough on their plate as it is. I don't want to stress them out by talking about my feelings about exams. They might feel a bit of shame that they don't want their parent to think they're stressed as well
Yeah.
or worried, and that they want their parent to think that, yeah, I've got it all together. Don't worry about me, mum or dad. I'm fine. So again, we just don't know what's going on there for our teens. So I think going back to the, do you know what I've noticed? That
Yeah.
you seem really chilled and really relaxed. And I'm wondering, like, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? Because I know it's a really stressful time
Mhm.
usually. And I just wanted to check in with you, and often that can be that first step in,
Mm.
because we have to say what we see. You have to say what you see, because a lot of the time people hold on to these feelings of stress and emotion and they're trying to bottle it up.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think if you said, oh, look, I've really noticed that you seem super chilled, like overly chilled, and that's not normal.
Mm.
I thought you would have been like feeling a little bit stressed. And that might be that kind of, that way in for them to go, well, I am a bit stressed,
Yeah.
and that's where you can go, oh, okay, tell me about that. Not go, oh, thank God for that, because I
Yeah.
thought you were horizontal and not revising, and, but it'd be like, oh, okay, you know, talk to me about it. Tell me
Yeah.
about how you're feeling, And they might go, oh, I don't want to talk about it now, Mum, because you've got so much on yourself. And that it's that
Yeah.
that little bit of that information about you've got so much on yourself, they're prioritizing your feelings over their own. And that's where you need to say as a parent, no, you're my priority. I want to know how things are going for you. And I think that can be a step in, and certainly using the strategies and the skills
Yeah.
that you talked about today, Caitlin, about validating feelings, normalizing these feelings as well, that's really important. And acknowledging the amount of stress that it is something that our teenagers sometimes need to hear.
Absolutely. I hope that was helpful. Thank you ever so much for sending that question in.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, just
yeah.
being mindful of your emotions too is really
Yeah,
important.
and checking in before we
Yeah.
we go in and increase the stress load even more. Yeah, so thank you very much, Diolch yn fawr, for joining us today for our Tonnau Talks on supporting exam stress. Please, again, use the QR code to gain access to our live sessions coming up. And also remember that you can listen to all of our Tonnau Talks on our YouTube channel, and listen to them at your own leisure. And please join us again next time. Thank you very much. Diolch.
Diolch yn fawr.